Hi, Eleanor here. Just going to give you a little YouTube tutorial on metabolism, which is essentially the process in our body where we convert the food that we eat into energy. Okay, so let's think about how this all starts off. So we start off with our human body and then we eat food. And the ultimate aim of our digestive system is to break that food down into small parts so we can get into our cells. So we eat our food, it goes in through our mouth, it then proceeds down our body and enters our digestive system. And ultimately in the digestive system, it's broken down and it enters into our body and it enters into our cells. So here we have an image of our cell here. And the ultimate destination of the food we eat is into this little thing here, which is called a mitochondria. And here we have it sort of in a large version. And this is the place in the body where all the energy production takes place. So we have about 1 trillion of these cells in our body, and then there's loads and loads and loads of these mitochondria in each one. So that enables us to produce energy to keep us alive. So there are two basic processes that our body needs to go through in order to create energy. So first of all, there's substrate phosphorylation. So substrate just refers to the starting product. So that's the food that we eat. And this is when we break down the food, but we're creating the energy from that food without the use of oxygen. Then we have oxidative phosphorylation, which is when we add oxygen into our system and then the food that we eat then gets converted into energy. So this process here produces about 10% of the energy that we use on a daily basis, and this one produces about 90%. So it's a lot more efficient if we can produce energy this way. And these processes work to produce this molecule here, which is called ATP. So this is like the energy molecule of the body. But they work at different rates and they produce different amounts. So that part of that is we're going to look at how much they produce today. So let's look quickly at this molecule ATP. So it's called ATP, and that stands for adenosine triphosphate or adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so we have an adenosine at the start, and then we have 3, so triphosphate molecules. And these molecules are bonded onto the adenosine molecule here. And the bond contains the energy. So when we want energy, we have to remove one of the phosphate molecules of the ATP, and that turns into then ADP, adenosine diphosphate. And the energy and the phosphate molecule are released off the ATP. So we use the energy then to power the work that we do in the day. And the phosphate molecule sort of hangs around, just waits for something else to happen to it. And what happens to it is that it gets joined back on again. Okay, so what happens is the ADP captures the phosphate molecule again that's floating around, and then we store the energy back in the bond. And this process cycles round and round and round throughout the day. So this part of it is fairly obvious. So we break the phosphate molecule off and that gives us energy, and then we create ADP. But this part of the system is the one that's the crucial thing, because ultimately the food that we eat and the energy that we get from that food is the energy that this phosphate molecule uses to attach itself back on to create ATP again. So if we didn't eat our food, we wouldn't have energy, we wouldn't be able to attach the phosphate molecule back on and make ATP again, and then we would be in trouble. So when we want to make energy, there are a certain number of things that we need to have in our body for that to happen. So the first thing is a substrate. Now a substrate is just what you start with. So if you were building a house, the substrate for building a house would be a brick. So the substrate in the human diet are just the macronutrients that we eat. So that's your carbohydrate, your fat and your protein. We need to break those down then, and for that we need enzymes. So enzymes act on our food as it progresses through the digestive system. We also need coenzymes then. So coenzymes help the enzymes to do their work, and these are usually vitamins, and particularly for our energy we use B vitamins. We also have things called cofactors, and these are compounds that help this general process to happen, and they're usually minerals. So we need to eat our macronutrients to give us energy, but also we need to eat our vitamins and minerals, the micronutrients, to help us get the energy from the macronutrients. And then also you have to use energy to help you make energy. So our digestive system just doesn't work on its own. It needs energy in order to do all that churning, all that pushing, all that grinding down, all the chewing that you do to break your food down. And then finally, we need a metabolic pathway. We need a starting point, we need a middle and an end. And we're going to look at the metabolic pathways for carbohydrate and fat. And ultimately, what these six things are going towards is giving us the basic equation of life, okay? So here we have our glucose molecule. So that's the smallest unit of the substrate carbohydrate. So C6, so C for carbon, H for oxygen, H12, and O for oxygen. So C6H12O6 is the chemical formula for glucose, which is ultimately what everything gets broken down to in our body. If we can add some oxygen to that by breathing, slightly critical there, ultimately we're going to produce carbon dioxide as a waste product, which we breathe out. We're going to produce water, which we also breathe out, sweat out, and wee out. And ultimately, and this is the really end goal, we're going to produce energy. So there are 5 basic stages of metabolism, so 5 processes that we need to go through to produce energy. Well, first of all, we need to eat. Okay, so any diet that tells you not to eat or not to eat a certain nutrient is not good for you. Once we've broken it down then, they're going to enter their specific metabolic pathways and we're going to convert them into a molecule called pyruvate. So ultimately carbohydrate and fat turn into something called pyruvate. We then convert that pyruvate into something called acetyl CoA, and this is a very critical molecule in our body because once we've converted our fat and carbohydrate into acetyl CoA, we're then on the road to making energy. Then we break down the acetyl CoA and that breakdown creates energy, more on that later, and then we capture the energy. And that ultimately, the energy we capture from the breakdown, we use that to reattach the phosphate bond onto ADP to make ATP. So let's look at each stage in a bit more detail. So on each stage, we're going to look at what, how, where, and ultimately what happens. So in stage 1, we break down our macronutrients into their smallest units. And how do we do this? Well, the enzymes in our digestive system break down the macronutrients into their smallest molecules. So carbohydrate is broken down by amylase into glucose. Fats are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol by lipase. And proteins are broken down by protease into amino acids. And for the purpose of this video and for your assignment, we're only going to look at what happens to fat and carbohydrate. So we're not going to look at the metabolism of protein. Where does this happen? Well, this takes place in the digestive tract or the digestive system, and primarily in the small intestine, which is this sort of like sausage-like sort of knitting spaghetti pile of things looking here. Okay, so this is where most of the enzymes get to work and breaking things down. And as a result of that, our glucose molecule from carbohydrates and our glycerol and fatty acids from fats are ready then to enter their specific metabolic pathway, the process that they're going to need to go through in order for us to generate energy. So stage 2. Okay, so the next stage is that the glucose molecule is further broken down into a molecule called pyruvate. And the way that it's broken down by this process here called glycolysis. And I'll say more about that a little later. And at this point, glycerol joins in as well. So they're sort of running on a parallel track now. So the 6-carbon glucose molecule is reduced down to 2 3-carbon units called pyruvate. So if you think back to the equation of life that we looked at the start, the equation said C6. So the 6 refers to how many units there are of something. So we've got 6 carbons in our glucose molecule. So essentially we're going to divide that in half. And we're going to divide it in half, and what we end up with is something called pyruvate. And then the glycerol that comes from our fat is also converted to pyruvate. And this happens in the cytoplasm, or it's sometimes called the cytosol, which is like this sort of watery area that you have in your cell. And as a result of that, we've generated pyruvate, and then depending on how much oxygen we've got in our body, it can either go off somewhere where there's very little oxygen, or it can go off somewhere where there's lots of oxygen. So it's more beneficial for us if it goes through the process that has the oxygen in it, because we can produce more energy from that. So the next stage, so if we think about what happens if we have oxygen, which is generally most of the time because we don't go around holding our breath or deliberately not breathing, we have oxygen in our body. So then we convert the pyruvate that's come from the glycerol and the glucose molecule into something called acetyl CoA, and the fatty acids that we broke off our fat in stage 1 are also converted by another process called beta oxidation into acetyl CoA. So the whole thing joins together, so our fats and our carbs ultimately make acetyl CoA. And the way that they make acetyl CoA is that another enzyme comes along, but this is a coenzyme. It's called coenzyme A, and it joins onto a pyruvate molecule and it makes acetyl CoA. And then the fatty acids are broken down by a process called beta oxidation into acetyl CoA. And this takes place in the mitochondria, which is what this image is showing here. So this is a mitochondria cell. And as a result of that, the glucose and the fat that we've eaten have been broken down and have ultimately been broken down into a molecule called acetyl CoA, and this now goes into something called the Kreb cycle. And in the Kreb cycle, we break the acetyl CoA down again. And as a result of this breakdown, we generate carbon dioxide, which we breathe out as a waste product, and some energy is generated. So what happens is that the acetyl CoA joins the Kreb cycle. And it's called the Kreb cycle because it's basically a cyclical or circular reaction. It just goes round and round and round and round. So it's like a water wheel at a mill. It just keeps picking up acetyl CoA that we get from our food, and it just keeps sending it round and round the system. And as it goes round and round the system, we change it and we break things off it and we add things to it. And ultimately what we produce are these two things here called NADH and FADH2. And in those two molecules, we've got electrons and hydrogen ions. And this is what the energy is stored in that's going to help us reattach the phosphate onto ADP. And this takes place again in the mitochondria. So once we've got our NADH and FADH2 molecules, we can now go on to the last stage of the process, which is like the electron transport chain. So in the electron transport chain, the electrons and the hydrogen ions are broken off these two compounds here, and they're used to create a pressure gradient. So this is all happening inside of here, and what happens is that the pressure and the hydrogen ions and the electrons get passed along inside this compound, and they're pushed in and out of this little cell, and the pushing generates pressure, a pressure gradient. And in order for them to be pushed along and for this process to happen, we need oxygen. So that's ultimately why we need to breathe, because if we didn't breathe, we wouldn't be able to have this process. Okay, so we've pushed the hydrogen molecules out of the mitochondria and we've created pressure. And ultimately, at the end of the electron transport chain, we force them back in. And the pressure we generate by forcing them back in makes a reaction happen. It catalyzes a reaction. And this pressure and this reaction that comes from it prompts this enzyme here, enzyme ATP synthase, it's called, to make the phosphate join back onto the end of the ADP. So this happens in the mitochondria and its surrounding membrane, and as a result of that, ATP is resynthesized. So we've got hydrogen hanging around, here it is here, and we've got oxygen hanging around. We need to get rid of that, so we combine the two together and we form water. So we breathe that out, or we excrete it out to be polite, or we sweat it out. So ultimately, when we eat our food, when we eat our macronutrients, we are breaking it down, and the breaking down of those macronutrients, all that it's doing and all we want to do is to make this happen. We want to create some energy which is going to make this enzyme, ATP synthase, join the phosphate molecule back onto ADP, and then we resynthesize ATP. And then when we want the energy, we break the phosphate bond off, and then the whole system starts all over again. And homeostasis is maintained in the body.